Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. Today we're going to look at another Unified Minds deck. This time it's going to be a Welder version of Whimsicott GX. Let's get into the basic concept. And that is that Whimsicott gets far better post-rotation for a lot of different reasons. Firstly, there's less gust in the format, so you force your opponent to attack into Whimsicott more turns during the game. Therefore, more opportunities for you to flip heads and negate a turn from them, basically. You say no to that damage if you're able to flip heads with the Fluffy Cotton ability. So essentially just having more opportunities for that to work gives you more opportunities to buy free turns to really get yourself ahead of the opponent. Secondly, Fairy Charms, they're much stronger post-rotation because Field Blower has now rotated. There's only a handful of decks that are playing answers to these Fairy Charms, so it can really be nice at stonewalling out some Ultra Beast-based decks. And Pikarom, sometimes it is playing Lysander Labs. I've sort of teetered around with them, but if you're not playing Labs, they can really have a bad time. They sometimes are limited to only one Mewtwo to attack against you, so these charms really are a really awkward thing for your opponent to get around. And finally, Toy Box is a much better build-around style attack now. It used to be that you could just get let loose as soon as you Toy Boxed, so it was usually just pretty useless. Now that's far less so the case. Yes, there's still Reset Stamp, but that's giving you a lot more cards, so you're a lot less worried about that. And at the same time, you know, if they're stamping you early, they're not stamping you late, so that's always pretty good. So Toy Box, much better in this format, and it really helps us get these other evolutions rolling, which then gets us into a very powerful board state. We are playing the fire support in here, as I mentioned, Welder. It's not only used for the Welders themselves for damage, but we're also playing Ninetales for gusting, and Salazzle for supplementary draw once we've already got that Toy Box rolling. So we do start to draw a lot of cards with this deck once that Toy Box gets us into a good setup. So this really is a nice build around attacker these days. Let's look at the Pokemon, starting off with 4 copies of the new Cottonee. It simply allows us to draw a card, so it's an upgrade to the previous one. Then we have 3 copies of our main attacker, Whimsicott GX, 190 hit point fairy type stage 1. Fluffy Cotton's that ability. If you flip heads, you prevent all damage done to yourself from the attack that was just incoming, so that's always pretty good. This doesn't have to be active either. This does also work for the bench, something to bear in mind. So really phenomenal ability that can buy us free turns. Energy Blow is its main attack. For a single fairy, you do 10 plus 30 times the amount of energy attached to this Pokemon, so it's essentially like a 40 if you just attack with a 1 fairy on top of it. But we then have things like triple acceleration and, of course, the Welder synergy to try and push this into good 2-hit KO maths. And sometimes if the Whimsicott goes unchecked for long enough, especially if you're able to flip some lucky heads consecutively, this can get into silly numbers. So Energy Blow is definitely a dangerous attack that can build up to good shape. Then we have the Toy Box GX attack, as I just mentioned. It's a big part of this deck. The sort of consistency all happens at once, really. You get your first Whimsicott. That's like phase 1 of the deck. Then you use your Toy Box, and then you get into these other stage 1s. You get your Welder online. You get things like the Giant Furnace out the deck. You get all those energies flowing, and it really starts becoming a different beast after that. So the Toy Box is definitely a big reason why I believe Whimsicott could be successful in this format. From there, we have the supporting cast, the 1-1 line of Alolan, not Alolan, I'm so used to saying that, a regular Ninetales, Nine Temptations. You can discard 2 fire from your hand and then switch one of your opponent's bench with their active. So it's a Lysander effect, paying 2 fire to do so. Very, very nice when we're already playing the Welder synergies. We have Fire Crystals in here to try and reuse this if we can. And that's obviously going to be fantastic for us. We also have that Ditto Prism Star, which acts as like a second Vulpix, a 5th Cottonee, or a 3rd Salandit, which is always fantastic. Then we're going to play 2 60 hit point Salandits. It's critical to play this one, not only because Call for Family is a reasonable attack, but also because we are playing an Elm engine, so you got to play the low hit point ones. But we also have 2 Roast Reveal Salazzles, so I feel pretty confident in an Elm engine in this deck particularly, because we have essentially 5 good stage 1s that we could have in our hand. The 3 Whimsicotts or the 2 Salazzles, which, you know, after an Elm you can just evolve and at least start drawing cards. So like Whimsicott or Roast Reveal, one of these is going to be good. We also have like Pokegear outs, we have Cherish Ball outs. We have so many ways to be like content to Elm turn 1 and then just be happy to either Toy Box or like Roast Reveal and get rolling from there. So I feel this deck is one of the best like Elm decks that we have post-rotation. Then we have 1 copy of Dedenne GX. Obviously that Dedenne change can get us out of bad hands. Again, we're playing for Cherish Ball to help with Whimsicott, but also it doubles up for helping Dedenne and giving us, again, just more outs to just dead hands. Obviously, we try and use this sparingly if we can, because we don't want to give our opponent easy prizes when we want them to go through fluffy cotton as often as possible. So something to bear in mind, but it's a necessary evil to give us a good consistency boost overall. It's worth it for the amount of outs that you sort of gain in your deck, really, to be out of like a dead hand. Onto the trainers. 1 copy of Reset Stamp. Obviously, it's really nice after one Whimsicott finally does get hit through. You flip tails, try and stamp them, make life difficult for them. So you get follow-up attackers, which is always nice. Although it is just 1 copy, we do draw a lot of cards with this deck once you get those Salazzles going. And you will have times where this is just going to be accessible to you. And we also have Diantha in the deck, obviously being a fairy-type attacker. So if you reset stamp relatively early, or like if you reset stamp them down to 3 cards, you can then Diantha and stamp them back down to 1 card. So you can get multiple uses out of this one-of. Then we have 2 copies of Fire Crystal. It's obviously important because if, you know, a Whimsicott with a bunch of energy goes down, or if we're using Ninetales, or if we're using Salazzle, all of these things combined with the Fire Crystal. Honestly, I could see myself trying to fit in the 3rd copy, because it is a pretty nice card. Many times you will Diantha back a Fire Crystal, just something to bear in mind, but so far we're playing 2 copies. 3 copies of Pokegear. I've tried my hardest to try and find spaces for 4, but I could only find space for 3. Let me know in the comments where you would find space for the 4th Pokegear. I can't really see it, to be honest. But yeah, giving us better consistency for finding Elm turn 1, and just getting into Welders and Cynthias and all that other good stuff. Also giving us access to Diantha in the first place is always great. 4 copies of Cherish, 4 copies of Com. We want to get that ball search rolling. We want to get into our stage 1s as quickly as possible. Having maximum outs to get toy boxing is really vital. And of course, Cherish Ball for the Dedenne out as well is great. 1 Ultra Beast Fairy Charm, as well as 1 Lightning Fairy Charm. These cover some pretty big archetypes, to be honest. Ultra Beast Charm, obviously good against Blacephalon GX. Great against Beast Box, if that's going to be an archetype for Worlds. Great against the Ultra Necrozma base builds as well, which is fantastic. And then the Lightning Fairy Charm, pretty much just for Pikarom, but although they are playing Lysander Labs, you force extra cards out of the opponent. You can undo some early turns of their damage. Oftentimes they need to full blitz to get other attackers rolling. So even then, even if you're just using this to deny like 2 turns of attacks, it's like you flipped heads twice in a row. So even if they are going to labs you, we play 4 stadiums and Diantha, so if they labs and knock out an active with a Fairy Charm, even if they play a labs that turn, they still need to flip. We need to flip tails for them to even do anything anyway, and they need to commit Electro Powers sometimes. So we can then just try and get counter stadiums going, or if our Fairy Charmed Whimsicott does go down, we can still then Diantha back that Fairy Charm and try and re-establish it with counter stadium and stuff like that. So these 1-ofs, again, they can extend to 2-ofs if Diantha is important for these specific cards. Couple copies of Viridian, because we are playing an energy split here, so making sure that we can get into Fair Energy to Toy Box, or Fires for all our other shenanigans is important. Heat Factory is still a great card for allowing us to dig deeper into the deck. And I am playing 1 copy of Giant Furnace. Yes, that's 3 different individual stadium cards. The only time I kind of like this is when you have tutoring effects, and we definitely do in this deck. Toy Box, getting you into the likes of Welder, Furnace, Salazzle, Ninetales. Like, sometimes that's generally like 4 of your 5 cards that you find. Sometimes it's even like you grab yourself Fire Crystal after that as well. Like, those can easily be your Toy Box 5 cards right there. Like the 2 Fire Stage 1s, the Welder, the Furnace, and the Fire Crystal. So you can then just go like Roast Reveal, get a bunch of cards into your hand, Fire Crystal it all back, gust something up, and then Welder and smack with Whimsicott. Like, that can genuinely be like your turn 3 sometimes. Giant Furnace makes that happen a lot more often than a Viridian, so I like having the 1 copy for exactly those times when you want to Toy Box and go nuts with your fire support. So that's a really nice include, I think, in the deck, and pretty mandatory. It's really hard to say no to having it. At one point, I only had Furnaces, but I did sort of see the light and realize that we need Viridian for extra outs to Fair Energy, because we play a relatively like low count. Onto the supporters. 1 copy of Diantha. I've mentioned her a couple times. It is only a 1-of, but we do have the Pokegears to try and help scout her. And of course, we do draw a decent amount with, you know, things like the Salazzles, the Welders, the Heat Factory, stuff like that. We can draw a good amount of cards. So accessing this Diantha isn't all that difficult. And like I said, it can just reload your Fairy Charm if somehow your opponent's got around it that 1-of time. It can reload stadiums to bounce things like Power Plant. That's another reason why we play a high count, we want to bounce Power Plant as soon as we can. And it can just get us access to things like Fire Crystals and whatnot in more generic matchups where you want to have more access to Gust with Ninetales, or just dig deeper with things like your Salazzle. So something to bear in mind. This one-of is pretty nice. I use it pretty much every game if you can. 3 copies of Welder. Obviously, it's good for accelerating into your Whimsicott. 3 copies of Cynthia. It's good early game, like Shuffle Draw if we really need to. Definitely on like turn 2 for helping us find things like our stage 1s once we've used that turn 1 Elm. That's why we're going to maximize the copies of Elm, because we want to just guarantee like Ditto, Cottonee, and usually Salandit comes first, especially if you've like started another Cottonee. So yeah, it just means that you can get your plethora of Pokemon down as quickly as possible, so you can have backup Whimsicotts if you do start flipping tails, as well as getting your other stage 1s online ASAP. Elm is pretty clutch, and then he sort of also acts as a nice option to use alongside your comms, even on turn 2 as well, so something to bear in mind. Onto the energy, like I said, it's a bit of a strange split. 3 copies of 3CE. This is another card that you can Diantha for in some generic matchups, because it is a burst of 90 damage just by attaching it for turn. We then have 6 copies of Fire Energy. So you do have to be quite careful with these cards. Like I said, sometimes you will Diantha back Fire Crystals because it's a limited amount of cards. 2 of them have to be committed to your active Whimsicott. Some of them are being used for Roast Reveal and Heat Factory. Some of them might be necessary for Ninetales. So making sure you take full advantage of your Fire Crystals, and the 6 copies that we have here is definitely mandatory. One of your deck checks will genuinely be the Fire Energies that you have in your deck pretty much every game, and if you have access to Diantha, and if you have access to both your Fire Crystals, because these are really important cards. I wish you could play more, but you just can't fit it. Again, I want a 4th Pokegear, I want a 3rd Fire Crystal, I want all sorts of things in this list, to be honest. I've tried this deck like a reasonable amount, and it is just a very tight list overall. I get away with a 5 Fairies just because we also have the double Viridian, so I feel like we have reasonable outs of trying to dig towards this. So we can Toy Box, and as soon as you do Toy Box, you know, everything starts to look a lot better. So definitely something that I think is not a bit of an issue. But yeah, again, just trying to manage these resources is important. This is actually quite a difficult deck to pilot, I would say, from how I've tested it so far. But just something to bear in mind. Some strange counts that look odd. Like you'd think you'd want to have more fairies or max out the 3CE count, but you just don't have that luxury of space, I'm afraid. So here's the full list. Pause now if you want to. I always try to get it down in the description as well. If anything, this is more so for me, so I can get it all in the description a lot easier. But yeah, let's move on to the tech options. Mew is actually something that you may not think of. You think, oh, we have the Fairy Charms for Pika, for Pikarom. We don't think it's a bit of an issue, but it actually can be an awkward matchup. Again, especially if they're playing the labs, life actually does get difficult for you. So you might want to try and add in a tech Mew so that they can't just take like an easy 2-prize snipe on, once again, things like Dedenne. You definitely have to try and be careful and not use it in the matchup if you can help it. So it's more so about discipline rather than having to play the Mew. That's pretty much how I'm putting it right now, because it is pretty much useless in every other matchup. There's also the new Whimsicott that comes out from this set that you could use for some extra consistency. Overall, I think it's not all that great. Again, space is just a big issue, and this is like a 65th card in my book. Wondrous Labyrinth is a stadium that I've had in and out of the deck. At the moment, it's out. I think it's pretty good against some non-GX matchups. But other than that, I don't feel like it's all that mandatory, and it doesn't work towards like our main goal of our like power spike turns with Welder and Salazzle and stuff. And in those opening turns, you just want to try and secure that as much as possible, because you can get into a pretty powerful board state with this deck. You just need to sort of work your way towards it, and having this Labyrinth doesn't really help us in that goal. Again, nice if there are going to be non-GX decks popping up, especially like 1-energy attackers like Zapdos or Spiritomb or stuff like that. It can be really hilarious against things like Nidoqueen as well, because it makes their 3Cs useless, but I don't think it's going to be all that great outside of some niche situations. And then we have the option to have Tantalizer and Palpad in the deck. Again, you could end up cutting one Cynthia for a Tantalizer, and then possibly like a Pokegear for a Palpad. I've thought about this a lot just because we still do get affected by status conditions, and things like Confusion and Paralysis. These really are annoying statuses that can get you get affected by, and it can buy your opponent's turn sometimes. So trying to work in that Tantalizer could always be an option, something to bear in mind. If you are worried about some status and giving your opponent free turns here and there, it can be an issue. So something to just bear in mind. I always like to give you the vanilla baseline, but you could try experimenting with the Tantalizer. Definitely something I want to experiment with myself. So onto the matchup overview. There aren't that many that are that awkward. In theory, obviously you need some flips going your way at times, and you can lose to like bad luck in certain circumstances. But I would only say this deck has a handful of very poor matchups. I think Reshizard's the first one on the list. Obviously, the Greens build is the one I'm mentioning here because they're usually playing Power Plants, and then they get through you instantly, and that's a big problem, especially because like our bounce back potential is quite weak compared to something like the Whimsicott Porygon-based build, the Porygon-z list. The Porygon-z list can get back all of its rescue energies like straight away and slam them back onto a new Whimsicott and then just start swinging again, whereas we sort of have to go like, okay, attach Welder, then we just hit you for 100, and sometimes that's not enough to 2-hit KO if you weren't having enough energies in play in the first place, or if the Reshizard has things like heal, which as we know it does. So if they do like a mixed herb plus power plant play, like we just lose the game outright. So I think Reshizard's one of your hardest matchups. Quad Keldeo as well feels pretty impossible. You can maybe try and attack with some of your non-GX shenanigans, but usually that won't get you very far. And also Rowlet Eggs I think is very awkward, similar to what I just said with the Reshizard. Just them having their mixed herb turns. Rowlet Eggs is very much a similar case. They have way too much healing for this archetype. Our damage output is just way too low, and they will be able to have that few turns to get their board setup going, and the healing will just outdo us most of the time. Yes, we're negating turns of damage coming into us on occasion, but they're basically doing it every turn anyway with the amount of like Gardenias and mixed herbs and great potions and stuff they have rolling in their deck. They're basically flipping heads every time, if you think about it that way. So yeah, Rowlet Eggs is definitely a poor matchup. So here are my closing thoughts. Once again, it's one of these archetypes that can take full advantage of the fire support that I'm a huge fan of. Like, Ninetales is just a busted card in this format, as is like the Heat Factory and Salazzle. Like, fire just has way too much support right now, and this being a deck that can try and work that in and mold it to try and like get the most benefit out of it is really cool. And the toy box gets them all into play. That's another thing that's like absolutely awesome for this deck. If your toy box sticks, you just are able to get an ideal turn like 2 or 3, which is absolutely, well, yeah, turn 3 obviously because you've evolved. You get like an ideal turn 3 out of it, which is just so insane when you have things like Gust at your disposal, and you can draw like 9 cards that turn or something, which is just silly sometimes. So it really does get out of control, and this fire support is just absolutely nuts when it's sort of used to its fullest potential. Fairy Charms are just really annoying, but something that I think people will be aware of and will start playing around. At the moment, I've seen like more Pikaroms play labs than not play labs, so that's something to bear in mind. Also, things like Pikarom, they can play Mew and Mewtwo, of course, so they can have ways around it. You don't just attach one charm and win the game, but it's still going to be an awkward card. And yeah, my only real issue with Whimsicott is that you are relying on coin flips at times. Maybe you just lose 2 coin flips on the bounce and then you have to scoop straight away, and it's a pretty bold strategy trying to go into Worlds and being like, man, I hope the flips are on my side. Obviously that's somewhat the case with every deck that you play in the sort of RNG of how you actually draw in the initial stages, but you're not only relying on draw RNG, you're also then relying on coin flip RNG on top of that to go deep in a tournament, which is a very scary prospect. So good luck to you if you do wish to do so. It may be for those gamblers out there rather than the people who want to have a more safe play. But that said, on paper, Whimsicott does have some impressive matchups. So not one to be slept on. If you think about it as like an anti-meta deck, if you're expecting lots of Pikarom and lots of Blounds, this could be a pretty good deck for you, to be honest. It's just a really annoying one for people to get around. So let me know what you think about Welder in the description below. Do you like the Porygon build, or do you like the Welder build that I've shown today? I'll try and get around to uploading the Porygon one sometime soon as well before Worlds, because I do need to experiment with that one a little bit more. It's kind of more high rolly because you need to spend your toy box getting like candy combo pieces, which is a lot more difficult than getting toy box for like all your draw cards that this deck can do. So you end up having to like get the rare candy, the Porygon, and like 3 recycle energies and just hoping that sticks in your hand, otherwise you can be really upset. So it acts pretty differently to the Welder build, but that's all I have time for today, guys. Hope you did enjoy, and I'll see you tomorrow for another Unified Minds deck. Cheers.